Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining me today because we are taking on a genuinely fascinating challenge. We're going to map out the complex architecture of how humans actually connect, persuade, and share information with one another. Our goal today is to break down the frameworks and structures of communication models. We're taking some pretty dense academic concepts and turning them into clear visual blueprints that you can actually use to understand the interactions happening around you every single day. Think about a recent conversation you had that just totally went off the rails. We've all been there, right? So, why is human communication so incredibly complex? Well, we're constantly interacting with ourselves, with others, and with our environment, often without even fully grasping our own objectives, let alone the impact our messages might have on whoever's listening. Because of all this ambiguity, our intentions just aren't always easily understood. But here's the good news. Human interaction isn't just random chaos. Beneath all that noise, there really is an underlying structure just waiting to be decoded. Okay, let's dive into this. We need to make a really vital distinction right out of the gate. What is the actual difference between a communication theory and a communication model? A theory is a conceptual analysis of events that's deeply grounded in extensive research. It's the heavy academic lifting. But a model? A model is an abstract representation of real-world phenomena. Think of models as our simplified blueprints. They highlight the essential, critical characteristics of a highly complex subject that we might otherwise completely miss in the everyday messiness of real life. And honestly, by looking at a model, you don't just understand the process better, you actually get a sneak peek into the exact viewpoint of the person who designed it. To make sense of all this, here is our blueprint for today. We'll start with number 1, the foundation, move into number 2, the flow of information, map out number 3, the taxonomy of models, and finally wrap up with number 4, why the map is not the territory. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the foundation, where we're going to look at the historical roots that actually still uphold modern public communication. It's honestly amazing how we can connect the ancient world directly to our modern, data-driven reality. I mean, Aristotle was the absolute pioneer in identifying challenges in communication. He developed a theory centered purely on the art of persuasion. In human public communication, he identified 3 fundamental elements that exist in equal measure. First, you have ethos, which is basically the speaker's credibility. Then there's logos, representing the actual logical reasoning in the speech or writing. And finally, pathos, which is the emotional response drawn directly from the audience. And you know what? Despite all the massive changes in how we communicate over the last 2 millennia, these foundational elements are still absolutely 100% relevant today. And that brings us to a really powerful realization. As the 20th century rolled around and shifted towards more scientific approaches, bringing in psychology, sociology, and linguistics, the sheer volume of information just exploded. But there is a profound truth we have to remember here. Models don't ignore complexity, they organize it. We literally need these models to impose coherence on our interactions, which allows us to generate real research inquiries and actually predict communication outcomes under very specific conditions. Let's move to section 2 and see how this builds. We're looking at the flow of information, specifically examining how messages actually travel between a sender and a receiver. Over the years, there's been a massive evolution in how we visualize communication. Historically, early models were linear. Think of them as a one-way street. The message flows strictly unidirectionally from the speaker to the audience, regardless of the effect it actually has. Now, these were super useful for early experiments, particularly if you were studying things like propaganda or mass persuasion. But they only depict a straightforward act. They don't capture the whole dynamic process. On the flip side, we have nonlinear models. These are dynamic, two-way circuits that facilitate bidirectional or even multidirectional flow, which you'll often see described as circular or convergence models. So the crucial point here is understanding how these nonlinear models actually function, and that is rooted directly in the principles of cybernetics. A cybernetic framework relies on information, feedback, networks, and purpose. Back in 1968, Deutsch Karl pointed out something fascinating. Human systems aren't just mechanically linked. They actually share information through networks and circuits. And a circuit is just a circular loop that makes a two-way exchange possible. That exchange generates feedback, and that feedback then prompts entirely new actions. See, action models, which are purely sender-oriented and just focus on how to formulate a message to persuade someone, they might work fine for mass media, but they often fail miserably in interpersonal communication. Why? Because they completely ignore this vital feedback loop. If the sender structures the message poorly, or the listener just sort of applies their own meaning, well, miscommunication thrives. Continuous feedback loops just reflect real, messy human interaction way better than those old one-way streets.
Which naturally brings us to Section 3, the taxonomy of models. Brace yourselves because we are about to take some incredibly dense academic classifications and chunk them down into a super easy-to-read blueprint. Okay, so our structural frameworks organize into a few very clear categories. First up, we have symbolic models, which break down into verbal and mathematical subtypes. Verbal models articulate theories using words. Think of Berlow's SCMR model or Lasswell's model. Mathematical models, on the other hand, like Shannon and Weaver's information theory, use graph theory and statistical concepts to quantify things like signal transmission and noise. Then we switch gears to physical models, which branch into iconic and analog. Iconic models use literal pictorial representations, like photographs, sculptures, or paintings of actual objects. Analog models are super fascinating, though. They bear a structural relationship to what they represent without actually looking anything like them. A great example, how a computer is so often used as an analog to describe the human brain. Let's slow down for just a second here to appreciate a simple but truly profound truth. When we take a verbal model, which, remember, relies purely on the structure of language to explain a concept, and we translate it visually, we get a graphic model. Graphic models, like Gerbner's general model or Wesley and McLean's mass communication model, schematically present exactly what verbal models can only explain with words. They let us literally see the theory, transforming an abstract bot into a concrete visual flowchart of information exchange. It's a real game changer for understanding this stuff. And that leads us to our final structural inspection. In Section 4, the map is not the territory. It's time to step totally outside the frameworks we've built and look at their real-world pros and cons. Let's start with the advantages. According to scholars like Mortensen and Chapanis, models serve some incredible functions. Step 1, inquiry facilitation. Because human communication has such ambiguous and elusive boundaries, a solid model gives us a broad perspective that helps us formulate the right questions and interpret our data. Step 2, clarifying complexity. A model distills intricate, messy events into simpler, highly comprehensible terms. It essentially imposes order on chaos. And Step 3, heuristic significance. This just means models offer hypothetical constructs that let us explore the relationships between different theories, yielding entirely new insights and conclusions we never would have reached otherwise. But as with literally any blueprint, there are structural limitations we have to impartially recognize here. First up is the risk of misleading oversimplifications. Critics rightfully argue that reducing complex human behavior to perfectly definable constructs can sometimes be just way too simplistic to warrant serious analysis. Second is the risk of overlooking relevance. Models can accommodate a surprising amount of imprecision, which means they might accidentally leave out totally critical comparative elements. And finally, premature closure. A designer might rush to a conclusion, creating a model that gives an unwarranted sense of completeness, which effectively closes the door on further exploration, even when the actual reality is far more nuanced. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate philosophical trap, captured perfectly in this famous warning from general semanticists: the map is not the territory. Mortensen observed that critics often see models being mistakenly treated as reality itself. Look, when we investigate an unfamiliar domain, we use a model, the map, to guide us. But over time, the model can start to serve as a proxy for the actual event. We start taking the map literally. And when we do that, a brand new form of ambiguity replaces the exact uncertainty the map was originally supposed to fix. We forget that our clean, structured little diagram is not the messy, completely unpredictable reality of actual human behavior. Which leaves us with this final, highly provocative thought to consider. We absolutely rely on these frameworks to make sense of the world around us, to organize complexity and to predict outcomes. But if every single communication model, no matter how meticulously detailed it is really just a simplified blueprint, how much of reality are we actually missing in our daily interactions? What nuances of emotion, context, and nonverbal feedback are just slipping right through the cracks of our maps? Keep that in mind the next time you find yourself trying to decode a really complicated conversation. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the blueprints.